Welcome again to the Health and Risk Communication for Public Health webinar series. Today it's my pleasure to welcome and have Dr. Robin Ireland from Glasgow speaking about his interesting research about sports in public health. And I'll introduce him briefly and explain how these webinars are going to be. Robin Ireland is an academic, a writer, and public health advocate whose doctoral thesis at the University of Glasgow in 2021 was titled Commercial Determinants of Health in Sport, the example of the English Premier League. Robin has continued his interest in sport and health and has had 2 books published which focus on the commodification of sport. This first book, Sport, Sponsorship and Public Health, considers how commercial brands use the passion of excitement to sport to sell their products to fans. The second book, Cutting the Mustard, considers how commercialization has transformed football using the prism of football club that Robin supports, Norwich City. Robin is the Honorary Director of the Research at the Health Equalities Group, Honorary Research Fellow in the School of Health and Wellbeing at the University of Glasgow, and Interim Head of Obesity Action Scotland. So it's my pleasure to have Dr. Ireland presenting at this webinar today. So as you noticed, probably for those who are familiar with these webinars before, we had a series of webinars talking about commercial determinants of health, and I think this is a nice closure of this group of webinars. Dr. Ireland, I think the floor is yours.
Thank you.
We have about 30-40 minutes to talk, and then we have questions, a series of questions. So for those who joined us now, can you please pop in your questions in the chat? I'll read them and share the session later.
Shining. It's a lovely day where I'm speaking in Glasgow, and I'm very relaxed. So it's part of the Health and Communication series, as Marco kindly said. And I want to very much talk about communication and how sport is communicated. So I've got 4 aims really of the webinar: to consider the commercial determinants of health in sport, to understand the power and emotional pull of the sports brand. Is it possible to regulate the impact of unhealthy advertising in sport? And can the sports brand be used to promote health? I will endeavour to finish with plenty of time for questions to be asked. You'll also get my email at the end. You're welcome to contact me. I know Marco's going to try and field questions. As I say, feel free. And also I'm aware that this webinar will go out on YouTube at one stage. So Marco's kindly mentioned that I've written a couple of books, and that's the basis of really what I'm talking about today. So I'm just going to diminish the images on the side so I can read my own slides. Story of sports sponsorship. Commercial brands have always used the passion and excitement of sport to sell their products to fans, but modern day commodification has taken this to an entirely new level. I'll talk a little bit about the tobacco industry, helped create modern sponsorship in the 1970s. And very much that approach is still being used. When other means of advertising are denied by regulation, sport offers a very attractive option for companies to put their products out there. As I've seen, tobacco started it. We're seeing gambling, alcohol, big food, and other unhealthy commodity industries using the same approach. And at the same time, as fans are encouraged to consume more, they're being told to behave responsibility in their consumption. Before I had my problem with the slides before, I wanted to actually make the point that I speak regularly, as you'd expect, in public health audiences and regularly in sport audiences. And I'm always entertained but concerned to find, generally speaking, a lot of people in public health don't get sport, and a lot of people in sport don't get public health. So if I can offer any means of getting groups together in discussion, that would be great. But that's generally what I find, which is interesting. So you know this about public health. I don't need to tell you, because I'm assuming I've got predominantly a public health audience. But as you know, people in sport might not, the leading causes of death worldwide are from NCDs. And we're starting to understand the role of transnational corporations in the promotion and marketing of unhealthy commodities, as Marco said at the beginning, around commercial determinants of health. Sport, as a part of our modern entertainment culture, provides an important medium for marketing, and very much in a globalized world. I'm always entertained to talk about sport nowadays because there's a strong feeling people my age tend to get very nostalgic and say, well, you know, this is all new stuff. You know, sport was great in the 70s and 80s. As somebody who went to football in the 70s and 80s, can I say it wasn't? It was racist, it was violent, it was misogynist. It certainly wasn't great, but it was still commercial. It was incredibly hard to sell in those times because it wasn't the attractive entertainment product that it's become. But sport has always been commercial. As soon as people put a fence around a stadium or put a ticket office there, of course it's been commercial. As long as people will pay to see a performance, and that's happened forever, basically. Um, but the transition is from that transition from amateur professional as it started to become a commercial amusement business. And advertisers were very quick to see the benefits of what was then a largely male audience, still more male, and also predominantly younger as well. And that's a very attractive target for advertisers. What really changed the game, though, pun intended, was the arrival of television in the 60s and 70s, and then a huge increase in broadcasting revenue, together with commercial income from unhealthy commodity industries seeking to access sports growing global audience. But that association between a perceived health activity, such as football, for instance, uh, should it ever be perceived a partnership with unhealthy food and drinks? Why have we got in this position? How can it ever be considered appropriate? Um, I remember when I was doing my PhD research, I wanted to understand a wee bit more about brands, and I wanted to understand more about where sponsorship came from. Um, as the simplest, easiest definition of a brand, it's basically a sign of ownership. And originally it was a stamp, and still used, of course, to identify an animal or who owns an animal. So if you look back, and if anybody's familiar with Galliano, South American writer writing about South American football, wonderful book. Um, in his book, he wrote about Uruguayan football legend Obdulio Varela. The first sponsorship that I'm aware of on the front of a shirt in football was in Montevideo in Uruguay in 1954 and Penarol. And this is a quote from him. He refused to have a sponsor's name on the front of his shirt. There was one game he went out where 10 other players had a sponsor's name on, and he would refuse to. And a quote from Obdulio, as a man of colour: "They used to drag us blacks around by rings in our noses. Those days are gone." He really didn't want to be branded, which look at where we are now. It hasn't gone well, Obdulio, I'm afraid. Brands are symbols and slogans developed by manufacturers to identify their products from their competitors. Um, when we live in such a complex world, the means of making your brand stand out, it's more and more complicated, it's harder to do. Sport offers that opportunity, and often with a global audience, while of course promoting commodity consumption. I'm going to talk more about football. I'll talk a little bit about other sports, but football being the most popular sport in Britain, certainly, and probably the most popular sport in the world. And I am sitting here in Scotland, who had rather a day of it, or rather an evening of it last night, should I say. So everybody's very happy up here, I think. Development of the Manchester United brand, they were arguably the first football club brand. A lot of writing about Manchester United, and those of my age will be aware of the history and tradition around Manchester United and when they built their brand, really, because it dates back to, in fact, the Munich air disaster in '58 and the beginnings of commercialization from then in 1960 and onwards. And as you can see on this slide, the uh, development of commercialization in that time. So the first private boxes in '64, souvenir shop in '67, installation of billboards around the stadium, so important now. That was in 1975. I don't know when. I tried to investigate this. I'm not quite sure when we first got billboards around the stadium. You'd imagine America was there first, but I don't know that. But in England, certainly 1975. Now, it's an interesting point. What are followers? Manchester United claim over 100 million followers, consumers, fans. We may go back to that in China alone. As Marco said, and as you saw from my book at the beginning, I've recently studied Norwich City, but it's the club that I support. And when I was doing my own PhD research, I found it incredibly hard to find when things changed in football. So as you can see from the top image there, I had access to, I think, actually quite an unusual archive in terms of following the history of Norwich City. And the image on the bottom left is the club brand in the rosette in the middle there that people used to wear. That's an original rosette from I imagine the 60s or early 70s, and that's the club brand as seen now. And as we know, as with Norwich City, as with any club, the history and traditions are critical. The colours, the nickname, the shirt, the song, the stadium, that's the brand. The emotion, the passion that goes with it. And in the 21st century, particularly, it's employed systematically to sell products and brands to football consumers. It was interesting for me to find, and you just don't find these things. You have to hunt to find these, and not, clubs don't put "we employed our first commercial manager" anywhere. But Norwich did in 1977. I'm sure Manchester United did theirs at least 10 years earlier. Let's go back a little bit and understand how sponsorship developed, and what a surprise. There's a considerable line of argument to say that tobacco industry were the key industry behind the development of sports sponsorship. And of course, you may be aware of cigarette advertising cards, and people still collect them now, and that they're still called cigarette cards a lot of the time. Strictly speaking, they're trading cards. I love the fact that way back in 1909, a baseball star of the time, Honus Wagner, refused to have his image used by the American Tobacco Company. We get very few. It might be a question later on. What do we see the role of superstar sports people in terms of standing up to sponsorship? You'll know the Ronaldo argument about Coca-Cola, for example. I mean, I don't really, but I'm happy to discuss it later. But it's nice to celebrate when people do stand up to corporate pressure. Cigarette advertising was banned on British TV in '65, USA in 1970, which is fairly remarkable, really, because basically we saw, and I'll show one or two no doubt later, but sports sponsorship provided a very easy way to avoid regulation. In fact, if you're into cricket and you know the history of cricket, you know that Sunday League and cricket was based around sponsorship from Rossman's John Player Special in the 1970s and 80s, way after theoretically cigarette advertising was banned. That playbook of using sport to avoid regulation and control of marketing is classic, and we see it now still being exercised. And although the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control came in force in 2005, F1 found a way around that with the Labour government at the time, and it wasn't enacted in terms of logos on motor racing cars until 2007. So 1965, 35, I'm just doing my maths, 42 years of Marlboro cars running around with basically a cigarette packet on the side of the cars, because that's what it looked like. People that know the history may know about this example, which is really quite disturbing in all sorts of ways. I would argue that this kind of framing is still very much used here. And way back in the 1920s, cigarette companies were aligning themselves theoretically with women's rights before women had the vote in many countries. And tobacco companies were encouraging women to smoke because it was seen as a symbol of liberation. And that's photo on the left is from an original badge produced at the time in the 1970s. You've come a long way, baby. It's very cynical, isn't it? So Philip Morris International launched their Virginia Slims brand in 1968 with a name suggesting slimness using aspirational images of confident, jet-setting, independent women. In tennis, women seeking equal rights and equal rights in pay led by Billie Jean King and colleagues, then worked with Philip Morris to establish the professional women's tennis circuit. And I mean, worked with Philip Morris. At one stage, Billie Jean King was actually on the board of Philip Morris. And even recently, I've seen her argue in her autobiography that it was perfectly legitimate to link with a tobacco company, and that didn't encourage women to smoke. Really, and it's a shame because she's an icon for lots of reasons, but not on this cause. The tobacco industry marketing of the 1970s, it's fairly easy to identify. You can't say entirely because of this, of course not, but over from 1965, an estimated 30,000 American women died from tobacco-related diseases. This figure had risen to 106,000 in 1985. Not obviously all to do with Philip Morris and Virginia Slims, but a part of it and the type of marketing and how it was used. Alcohol, Budweiser, they've been sponsoring the World Cup for a very long time, and they're still a sponsor in the World Cup next year in America. In 1953, as you can see here, August A. Busch Jr., I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, but the president of the Anheuser-Busch Brewery, can't say it, now basically called AB, the biggest alcohol company in the world. They purchased the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team, with the stadium being named the Busch Stadium in 1954. That was the first stadium that took a name of a sponsor, as far as I'm aware. It works. That's why they've done it. Budweiser have been associated with big sport for all this time. They drive through their product and their brand, even when there are national advertising restrictions, as you can see here. The last bullet point on this slide is important. When you're researching this, it's incredibly hard to find information. It's protected. It's behind walls. Companies don't talk about the type of profits they make as a result of marketing. In fact, they'll tell you that it doesn't actually have an impact when when they advertise. You hear them say it. Well, we just want to encourage people to pick our brand. It's about brand differentiation. It's not about encouraging people to drink beer. One piece that I found out, and I still think they're still using this slogan, light up the fire, light up the FIFA World Cup. Following the 2018 World Cup, revenues were driven up for Budweiser by over 10%. That's huge, with this campaign running in 50 countries using, as it says here, television, digital and social media channels. Final study in this segment, Fun 88 Newcastle United. I've written a paper on this. I haven't referenced everything. Do come back to me if you want to following up. This is referenced. This was part of my PhD, but looking at Fun 88, which was at one point the shirt sponsor for Newcastle United from 2017-2023. I checked just before this presentation, actually, because I think last season they were still a gambling sponsor, but now on the Newcastle United site, I note it says BetMGM is now the club's, in apostrophes, exactly as it says on their site, official betting partner. As it says here, Fun 88 evoked Newcastle United's cultural tradition to promote gambling and generate business globally. And incidentally, the business was seen as predominantly in Asia, and I'll come back to that. What I found really concerning was social media was extensively used to promote gambling and drive fan engagement through the use of free match tickets and betting offers. The image on the right was on Twitter, but retweeted, first put out by Fun 88, but retweeted by the club. And it's this, as we all know, no doubt, the ubiquity of gambling brands has enabled gambling to become a totally normal part of football culture. Back to football for a minute, or not back to football, I'm not sure I've left it. This is a few years old, but I mean, I could put this out anytime really. Anybody who follows football will find this type of image very regularly on social media. So this is was put up on Twitter or X, or Twitter as it was then, for the Crystal Palace versus Chelsea game, which was taking place on Sunday, the 30th of December, a few years back. And if you can see on the slide, kickoff in London, where the game was taking place, was at 12 o'clock. Can I just say, if you're a football fan, 12 o'clock Sunday kickoff is completely, utterly rubbish. It's just not when anybody thinks football should be. You haven't got time to do anything before it. You've got to get up and go straight to the game on a Sunday. Um, but there's a little sign in this global map as to why sponsors are massively happy about that, because the biggest audience of the English Premier League ain't in England, it ain't in the UK, it's actually in Asia, in much more heavily populated countries where, as you might remember, I said that Manchester United claim over 10 million supporters in China. Kick off in China on a Sunday night in Beijing, 8 o'clock in the evening. That's a little bit more comfortable, isn't it? And Bangkok, 7 o'clock, and if you're an early riser, you can even catch it in New York at 7 o'clock in the morning. So for a sponsor, this is probably optimum time, and that's really what it's all about. Fun 88's audience is in Asia, and a lot of gambling partners are certainly Asian focused, and often trying to encourage gambling in countries where it's illegal, but they can do it online. So China and India being examples of that. So English Premier League is a global commodified entertainment business. It's played in England, but it's a global product. It could almost be played anywhere. And you know this if you follow sport. Brand images are carried in all these places. Again, this is 2 or 3 years old, but again, entirely appropriate. This is Newcastle, Burnley at the time. Both clubs had gambling brands on the front of their shirt. Brand images are covered absolutely everywhere. You can see Bet365 all the way around the stadium. At one time, on some work I was doing for Channel 4, I counted literally hundreds of gambling brands just coming out all the time. You simply can't escape them. I'm talking specifically about gambling now, but of course there are other unhealthy commodities associated with football I'll come back to. And in the bottom right there, as it says here, and as I keep saying, brands use tradition, authenticity, excitement, passion, community, fun, energy, health and fitness to help you and want you consume more. I've talked about football. Here are some other sports and some images that I've just lifted from different places in the last day or two. I'm not a big cricket follower these days, but I went to Edgbaston actually last summer. Couldn't believe great big scoreboard with Dafabet all over it. And then when I looked, Dafabet, who are also on the front of shirts of Celtic in Scotland, have been for several years. In fact, were on the front of Norwich City shirts at one stage. Dafabet are right the way through cricket. I know that gambling has now got into gambling branding has also got into tennis. The image on the top right, well, you know, in years gone by, it was Marlborough. Now it's Red Bull. There's an interesting discussion people might want to ask about women's sport. Are the changes? Well, here's Lauren James sponsoring Pepsi. In the bottom right, uh, beer and rugby, a match made in heaven. Guinness have made a lot of money associating themselves with rugby, and the image again along with that. So the Guinness Six Nations is the biggest rugby tournament in this country, well, across Europe, I guess. Um, and it's all about that colours, that excitement and passion. I'm amazed I got this far without even mentioning Coca-Cola. They've been associated with the Olympics since 1928, including, incidentally, when the Olympics were held in Nazi Germany in 1936, when they were delighted to sell their product and to try and find a new German audience. I've already mentioned about Budweiser AB InBev. The colours are the same, aren't they? There's no coincidence there. And you look at Red Bull logo, you'll see the same colours, excitement, and passion. So I'm going to finish on this section of talk in a minute or two, but just to talk a little bit about regulation and then about local sponsorship. People who work in sport hate anybody wanting to talk to them about who's not involved in sport and regulating it. They hate it. They don't think that people who don't work in sport, they think they don't understand it. You know, and they see, don't you just hear all the time, sport and politics don't mix? Tell Donald Trump that. Tell Mr. Modi in India that. Um, go back to the 1936 Olympics or the World Cup in Italy under Mussolini. Tell people that. Of course, it's political because it's part of society. If it's part of society, if the market's out of line, if it's having too much effect, then it needs to be regulated. And sports business owners, it's all about money. It's all about income. They've allowed unhealthy commodity industries to benefit from the health halo their brands may accrue from. And as a fan, and I'm a fan, as a consumer, it's very difficult. And I don't know how I'd feel. And given I'm aware that I will have colleagues, for instance, perhaps from Newcastle today. As a fan, would find it difficult through the ownership of my club and the way it's owned now. And of course, I'm not singling them out. I could say that about a lot of other clubs and why owners invest in the way they do. I'm also aware that across Newcastle, Red Bull are insinuating themselves with every aspect of sport they possibly can. But any attempt to address unhealthy sponsorship marketing, as we know, will be aggressively opposed by commercial interests. And I mean aggressively. Just back to gambling a minute. You may be aware the Premier League has agreed to withdraw gambling sponsorship for the front of matchday shirts by the end of this season. It's a voluntary ban, arguably to reduce the visibility of gambling on players' kits and protect young fans, except the ban only applies to matchday shirt. It doesn't extend to other forms of sponsorship, and it only applies to Premier League. So my team, Norwich City, play in it's the Sky Bet Championship. Another team in the Championship, Stoke City, play in the Bet365 Stadium. The marketing is still there. It's symbolic. It's to try and make sure the government doesn't put more regulation on gambling advertising, which incidentally is in place in some other countries. So when we're saying marketing, and this is a Coca-Cola Premier League tie-up a few years ago in Liverpool city centre, shouldn't we be considered regulation and sponsorship? I'm again doing my research. I'm aware there was an inquiry into sports sponsorship in the UK in 1983, largely driven by the concern about tobacco advertising at the time. Unfortunately, at the time it said that because tobacco was a legal product, it's individual choice, and we hear exactly the same discussion. But nevertheless, it would be very interesting if there was an inquiry into sports sponsorship. The only one that I know, I don't know if there's been any in any other countries. It would be interesting to find out. And of course, it's not aimed at kids, is it? We don't want to encourage consumption of our products by young children. Let's talk about Red Bull. I could have done a whole session about Red Bull because Red Bull are the modern masters of marketing. Very clever. They've learned an awful lot from the tobacco industry. They've learned an awful lot from Coca-Cola, of course, where they share a sugary caffeinated drink. Absolutely remarkable to know that energy drink only launched in Austria in 1987, only the American market in 1997. How big is it now? And Dieter Mateschitz, pronunciation is gone today, isn't it? He passed away, I think, a year or two back. But he was quoted to say that if there wasn't a market for an energy drink, he'd create one. We got away without energy drinks before in 1987. Why do we need them now? It's full of caffeine. It's full of sugar. The audience is young. It's to try and embed a consumption habit for life. Its marketing is very much around individually focused extreme adventure activities, which marry well with the unhealthy commodity industry's framing of personal responsibility, individual risk. Ring a bell? Tobacco? Just a bit. Red Bull's move into Formula One motor racing came in 2005, and again, adding emotion to a brand through its sponsorship. Um, I love cycling. I love cycling, but sometimes these things, the kind of marketing passes by. It's become normalized. Wout van Aert, one of the most exciting cyclists in the world, known for his sort of individual rushes for the finish line or whatever. The bottom there is the very few cyclists are allowed to have an individual sponsor and to carry one on their helmet. I haven't researched this again. People might know more than me. It's unusual. You normally carry the brand of your overall team sponsor. Vogt carries Red Bull, and when he wins, and he wins regularly, he does a wings celebration, as you can see there. So every time Vogt does that, you can imagine for cyclist followers, young, exciting, risky, it's the image that they want. It's the image they promote. I was fortunate enough to go into Poland recently to give some talks around sport and public health and talk to them about energy drinks and again how they were promoted and exactly the same kind of approach you'd see here. Interestingly, and in front of where we are, energy drinks were banned from sale to the under 18s in Poland from January 2024. Then the consultation at the moment in England from banned from sale to the under 16s, and where I'm sat in Scotland, no discussion at all. I suspect the medical evidence is exactly the same in every country. However, despite that ban of sale, of course, they will still be able to continue their marketing because there's no controls over that. Right, briefly, I need to speed up a bit. I've talked very much about national professional sport, and it's difficult to change things if you're allowing sport to evade the kind of regulations we have on other types of marketing. But we should also consider local commercial partnerships. I think we need to consider commercial determinants of health at all levels. I think as parents and citizens, we should be prepared to challenge unhealthy sponsorships where they've been normalised. So I'm very much a supporter of healthy local advertising and sponsorship policies, appreciating that these can be difficult to put in place, but there are many in England. Interesting to know where partnerships with sports organisations is part of that. And if we think these things are important, as a case study, I'd hugely recommend reading this paper in the bottom right hand. Not one of mine this time, so nice to promote somebody else. This is an excellent investigation within BMJ by Sophie Borland about how McDonald's appeal against planning decisions against local authorities. If you look at the reasons that they give why it's inappropriate for them not to open a new fast food outlet, one of the reasons they often give is that they encourage healthy lifestyles. And one of the reasons McDonald's, and one of the reasons they gives for that is on occasions they're able to sponsor local football and rugby clubs. They use that argument successfully in Mansfield. They were able to open a new restaurant, and what can I say? Bless them. Ravenshead FC. I lifted this picture off the internet, December 2023. Lo and behold, that Mansfield had a fast food chain opened, and the local district council had objected to it. It was overturned on appeal for the reasons that McDonald's gave, that it encouraged healthier lifestyles. That's the bad bit. I've got about 8 minutes at most because I'm going to go over time otherwise. Just to talk briefly about how the brand can be a force for the good. I'm not going to play the video. I was never intending to do that. But if you haven't seen this, I hugely recommend this. Norwich City as a club issued this short film around mental health in 2023. When I was in Poland about a month ago, people there told me they'd seen it. So maybe some of you have. It's about using the brand to promote health. It can be done. We've allowed it to promote ill health. It doesn't need to. There are some very, very good community sports foundations around the country. I've done work with Everton in the community previously, so I just wanted to mention just one example of them. But what I would say is all the community sports foundations, whether that's in Newcastle, and practically I think every league club has one, they're not directly funded by their club. So if you think the club is doing all the good work, think again. The income largely comes from either the Premier League, the Football League, other charitable sources, sometimes local partnerships, but it isn't directly from the club. If the club do fund, it's in kind. So they might provide office space. And of course, they are allowing the Community Sports Foundation to use the brand, but I'm a little bit cynical about how clubs say they promote health. The very obvious thing is when they'll fund and support an intervention to support fans who are suffering, have mental health issues because of their gambling habits, at the same time when they've been for years having a gambling sponsor on the front of their shirt. I mean, that's hypocrisy as far as I'm concerned, and absurd. But there are some wonderful work being done by sports foundations. Everton work very hard to engage the most deprived areas within the city of Liverpool. They have a number of different sites they work from, and they being able to, using the power of the brand and the good work they've done, a huge amount of money has been put into that part of North Liverpool, and of course the new stadium development has also had a big impact, as you'd imagine, in the city of Liverpool. So my last few minutes, I can't remember whether Marco said this. I think he did. That honorary director of research of the Health Equalities Group, which hosts the Healthy Stadia initiative, which is something I actually set up about 18 years ago now, more than that. So a little bit of work, talk about what we've been able to do using the brand again and using sport to promote health. There's a definition of healthy stadium there. It's a setting like everybody anywhere else. So a healthy stadium is one which promotes health of visitors, fans, players, employees, and surrounding community. It's a place where people can go to have a positive, healthy experience playing or watching sport, and which promotes positive, healthy opportunities surrounding communities. So 4 or 5 examples here of what you can do. Stadium policies, community and fan health, campaigning and advocacy. So I will run out of time, so I'm not going to spend time on that. You can see the slides later. At European level, we've worked to develop tobacco-free stadia. Not an issue in the UK, not an issue in Poland as I remember it, still an issue in Germany. So you'd think you'd have tobacco-free stadia across Europe, but there's plenty of countries still that you don't. So getting that environment right, whether we're talking about tobacco or nowadays if we're also talking about vapes, or if we're talking about healthy eating, that's all part of the environment that people go and watch their sport within. Promoting active travel, which in one sense ought to be an easy win, encouraging people to go to stadium in any means apart from the car. I've been fortunate enough to go and see the Women's Euros in Holland in the past, and the biggest problem for me to get to the ground, I hired a bike and cycled, was actually getting my bike out of the bike park afterwards because there were so many other bikes there. Not something I'm used to in the UK, I have to say. I'll just go on, I think, over that slide. And here's a classic. I talked about football. There's great initiatives in Scotland here as well. And I don't doubt there may be people who are aware of initiatives like this in their local clubs. Well, while particularly men are uncomfortable rocking up at weight management clinics, they feel okay to go to their local stadium, to wear their club shirt, and to link with pals to help lose weight. And why not? Sport is so powerful, and it's so much nicer to be able to see sport used in that positive way. Of course, it can be done. We've also done work around sugary drinks and working with community sports coaches. So there's an example there: Tottenham Hotspur, Warrington Wolves Rugby, and Blackburn Rovers, working with them to use again the club brand to promote water as opposed to sugary drinks, and again, quite an effective intervention. So I think I've talked long enough, despite losing a few minutes at the start. So some conclusions and hopefully time for some question discussion. Companies want their brands and products to be associated with sports, excitement and passion. They want to be there, particularly in front of young fans, to promote consumption. They use the language of personal responsibility, drink responsibly, snack right, and when the fun stops, stop, whilst encouraging fans to consume more. I still feel there's a very limited discussion about the impact of unhealthy sports sponsorship on public health. Surely we should take it more seriously given the huge scale and audience for sport. It can be a force for public good. It very rarely is. We need to work harder to enable our clubs to work closer with the communities they represent. So thank you very much. I'll stop screen sharing. That's my email there. There's my website if you want to follow up. And I'll be delighted if there's an opportunity for questions. Apologies again for the hiccup at the start. Over to you, Marco.
Thank you, Robin. Right on time. I put my alarm, but I think I don't need to nudge you about that. So if anyone wants to ask questions, they can probably unmute themselves or write in the chat. You can also try to write in the question and answer section. I encourage people to speak up if they want to. I don't know if I can see people raising hands here or What? Give a few seconds. I have a question, of course. Maybe I can start with that. I'll give people time maybe to type. I'd like you to reflect on the role of gambling. So the gambling industry, as he said, is ready to fight back, let's say, regulation and so on, find new tactics. Can you elaborate on that and tell us a bit more about tactics they're using in sport?
Well, the ones that we know of, Marco, the ones that we know of, I think the most obvious thing that I can say is the access to politicians that they seem to have had. There have been a lot of meetings that have been declared with senior politicians. Politicians have to register where they accept hospitality from the gambling industry when they go to events. Several politicians have done that. It's not just football, it's also motor racing, it's also rugby. There's a saying, isn't there? If you're given a free meal, people want something out of it. And
Mm,
let's be very cynical here. I think
mm,
people have been persuaded. They've listened to the gambling marketing message and say it's fun. It's down to the individual. Individuals can stop it. I'm not in any way arguing that gambling should be banned because, of course, it never will be. And gambling's been a part of sport forever. I mean, horse racing was developed around gambling. Arguably,
mm,
cricket was based around gambling. It's the marketing of it that I completely object to. It's completely inappropriate. It's developing habits from young. And of course, what has changed from the Gambling Act in 2007. Have I got the
mm.
date right?
5 maybe.
Is of course the fact that, as you see, and if you go to a pub, I mean, I don't doubt last night there were people in the pub in Glasgow who weren't at Hampden Park on their phone and also watching it on the match, getting it on the TV, getting excited, having a few beers with them. You can bet just like that on your phone.
Mm,
And you know, when you got a game, I've no idea what the gambling figures of the gambling industry would tell you, but when you get to 2-2 and 90 minutes with World Cup qualification on, people get excited, don't they? So it's that's what it bothers me, is and that particular appeal to young people and the ability to gamble 24 hours on a whole variety of tactics. So I can see one coming through because it's coming through on my screen, but I'll let you deal with any, Marco.
Yeah, thank you. So there was Rachel was saying thank you for really interesting presentation. She had to go to another meeting, so she says hi. And then we have a comment from Daniel. Great paper, Robin. A question about global sponsorship. How do we combat this effectively? It seems that it seems to me that industries use sport, particularly online streams, to dodge national regulations and promote in multiple territories at once. For example, the state betting company. Is there any prospect of countries working together or WHO stepping in?
It's a great question, Dan. I don't know is the answer. It's difficult, but we can see. I don't know whether we, you know, what kind of society we want to live in because we ask questions. Clearly, you can block online activity. We see countries like China, we see countries like Russia blocking different channels, not in the interest of health, of course. Can we see that happening in health? I don't know, but we should absolutely be having those kind of discussions. And at the moment, we're finding that particularly social media owners and the kind of channels, exactly like other types of transnational companies, are fighting back about any kind of regulation. So it's very difficult, Dan. As I say, I don't know. I'd like to think so in the future because we need to appreciate the sheer impact this is having on our health, and the power of sport. Really, there are things that can happen, and it's the way images are used. I think we can have more control over that, and countries can force sport governing bodies to put different regulations in place. So, of course, we do know that's happening around gambling in one or two leagues, such as Italy and Spain, for example. That's not a comprehensive answer, but there isn't one. That's the best I'm going to come up with, I think.
Thank you. There's another question here. The Football Government, anonymous participant, Football Governance Act has recently been approved in Parliament. Is this a potential way to implement more regulations with regard to sponsorship and branding in football?
It's a really interesting one, isn't it? I'm a huge supporter of the regulator, and you have to note again that the Premier League, again, fought against the regulator because all sports hate people coming in and telling them what to do. They absolutely really hate, always have done. Will it have an impact on advertising? Well, not immediately, no. It will impact upon finance. It would be interesting to see, well, particularly around ownership, that's where it might have impact, and the type of owners that come in. But of course, we're now talking about billionaires, we're talking about sovereign states, and it may be that it's too late to close the door. I think the Premier League is almost a ship sail that we have so little control of it. I'm speaking as an embittered Norwich City fan, where the financial gap is so ridiculously huge. I think I'm starting to point that I'd like the likes of the Big Six to go and play in Europe in some kind of a Super League. The lower down the leagues you go, the more control we have, because there's less money. They're more dependent on the fan base. They're more dependent on linking with the community. So the income from the very big clubs is coming in primarily as commercial and broadcasting income. The lower down the chain you go in any kind of sport, the match day income becomes more important. Then there is more control. So the regulator, yes, maybe it will certainly raise more questions about money, but to be a little bit more positive, I'll give you a lovely example from Norwich, incidentally, where about 3-4 years ago we had they got overexcited, the Norwich City owners or business people there, and decided that it would be appropriate to have a gambling sponsor. And I forgot the name, but something like BK8. If there's any Aston Villa fans on this, they'll know the name, I'm afraid, because they ended up on the front of their shirt. They announced shirt sponsor for Norwich within 15 minutes, and I'm not kidding. The power of social media. Within 15 minutes, fans had got on the web and discovered that this was a Cambodian-based gambling company that use images of scantily clad young women to promote their products. And they said, this is not on. And Norwich City pulled out of the sponsorship 4 days later. Now, it was primarily because of the sexism, not the gambling, but nevertheless, sometimes, and we're not a tiny club, so sometimes fans have some kind of power, and I'd love us to exercise it more, because it's important. That image, that tradition, that history, it belongs to the fans, not the club. We don't tend to use it enough, but much more opportunity in smaller clubs, I think.
Thank you. There was a request for sharing slides. I think the Allow Thomas Davis will probably either contact you or me, and I can forward the slides if you can share them later.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. A lot of thanks from everyone. I have another question. If we have 7 minutes, so I think I can go with the next. So reflecting on our role of public health officers, public health researchers, what can we do to stop? I mean, the gambling, or the tobacco industry, or the beverage industry to advertise? I mean, is there some role for activism there, or is there something else we can do?
That's almost another hour, isn't it? But I'm going to give you a 2 or 3 minute quick answer. I noticed that you had, and I didn't hear the talk, so my apologies. But I mean, you've had some great speakers in this, so thank you for inviting me. I'm in exalted company. But I noticed one of your first speakers was Emma Boyland. Emma will have talked about the impact upon children of marketing. I think that is always where we should start, really, child health, or not always, but it's an incredibly important starting point. We should recognize the kind of advertising that we see in sport and the kind of marketing is to encourage unhealthy consumption by children. That's the angle. Sport already is aware of it. And for instance, I mean, I don't think it's in any rule book that you can't have an alcohol sponsor on the front of shirts, but they've decided that it's really not a good idea because of the association number. They've already made that position around gambling. That's an admission that gambling on the front of shirts has an impact. You know, even if it's voluntary, it's if you up until now well, of course, in the championship, if you're sponsored by a gambling company, which lots are, you cannot get, let me get my words right, you cannot buy a replica shirt in children's size if your club is sponsored by an alcohol gambling company. I mean, of course, it's garbage because we all know 12-year-olds that look like they're about 20 and giant size, in which case it was down by the size of the shirt, nothing else. But it's already a tacit admission that it's inappropriate for certain products to be associated with children. Well, are we pretending that when our big sports are played on our screen, it's marketed everywhere there, that children don't watch that aren't affected by it? If they're affected by the replica shirt, they're bloody affected by all the marketing on TV. So I think that's a framing I think we should use. And I don't, you know, most of us love sport. It is my passion. I hate it being used in this way. So I do think we need to frame those discussions. And I do think, though, a lot of people in public health don't really get sport. And, you know, if you don't, talk to people that do, and let's see how you'll see from a parent point of view, apart from anything else, you know, the impact it can have.
All right, thank you so much. I think I'll follow up with you in separately, because I'm putting together a bid on an NIHR Public Health Research funded project on commercial practices and gambling, which is due very soon, by the way. But I think we can have a separate conversation about that, with the idea of analyzing the tactics that the industry is taking to bypass the regulations. I think that's an interesting angle I think we can take a look at, particularly with sports.
Sure.
Amy. Yeah.
I just have one quick last question. It was just around the healthy stadium work, which sounds really interesting, and what your sort of next plans for that are. You've obviously had that for quite a long time. Would you like to see that sort of maybe being incorporated into policy, so that it's like a thing that stadiums want to get some sort of accreditation that they qualify in that status, that they're doing that community work? Just a bit more on that, because it sounds really interesting.
I'd need my colleague to comment more on that, Matthew Philpott, and do come back to me on that. It was an approach that we did take in the early days, and we did look at accreditation. You need quite a lot of funding from that, I think, Amy, is the principal problem. And I'm very, very aware how companies, stadiums, whatever, pretend to do something when they just want a little plaque to say. So it's difficult, but I think, and of course the funding has to come often from the club, and it's not something they'll generally want to pay for. But I'd love to see more initiatives around. There really are some very easy wins. I've talked about walking and cycling, and I could talk about one or two clubs that have done some brilliant jobs around that. So that's the sort of thing that Healthy Stadia or other partners can absolutely help with, and it's a win-win when you look at that. I think the food offer, I had a meeting recently with the people who are putting the Commonwealth Games on in Scotland. Now, I don't know whether we can have any influence upon big events like that, but the point I'd make is we should try, and we should ask. I think it's perfectly commercially viable in most stadia to offer healthier food. It's just they generally don't ask the question. They just make the assumption that everybody wants crap food, and it's, you know, whatever we can do. It's difficult, obviously, because you might have 15 minutes to, you know, feed a lot of people, so the choices are limited, but we can do a hell of a lot better, and there are good examples of that. So the whole Healthy Stadia approach, I think, is very viable. And again, as I say, the smaller down the chain, the lower down the chain you can, the more opportunity you can. You know, if your child or you go down to a local club, you can talk to them about the kind of food that's on offer. You can ask them about, you know, is it appropriate to have alcohol promoted in this way? So there are conversations you can have. I don't want to come away from this being negative, because I do think there are some positive things you can do. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Amy, for the question. I think we're reaching the end of today's webinar. I pasted in the chat a few links for those who want to register for the next one. So next week we have Dr. Claire Tolley talking about the strategies to communicate the risk of air pollution exposure to vulnerable groups. We're shifting away from commercial determinants of health thing. We're taking other interesting discussions now. And I thank everybody for attending, and I thank everybody for watching this recording when we'll have this posted on YouTube. For those who are interested in getting more information about the network, the links are below also to register for the future webinars and the network itself. Okay, thank you very much again. Thank you, Robin, for a wonderful presentation, and I'll see you next week. Hopefully.
Thank you for inviting me along. All the best. Cheers for now. Bye.